Okay, welcome back everyone. I think we have more or less everybody in the room. I know it's very hard to come back from lunch, but I promise this is going to be a very interesting panel. Do I dare to say maybe a panel that is going to outshine other panels? I don't know, maybe. I dare to say that. But welcome. My name is Federica Dallarche. I'm a senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers, Ettore, Ludovica, and Natalie, for entrusting me with chairing this session. And I also would like to thank you for including, again, this session in the program. It's not a given. But I think there's so much that we can share at intergenerational level. Some of you maybe yesterday have attended the Next Generation workshop. Among the brilliant contributions from young professionals and young researchers, there was one comment that really stuck with me. There was this researcher that said that people in their 20s do not really feel or understand the pressure and the urgency that led to the negotiation of arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament treaties because they didn't live through the Cold War. And there's also another element that sometimes people that are negotiating these treaties change oftentimes, right? So after 4 years, usually diplomats change. So there's also not so much of continuation in terms of knowledge. So I think this is exactly the reason why it's important to foster this type of conversations. And it is in this spirit that I really would like to structure this session today in a very conversational type of way, with the aim of sharing stories, learning from each other, enhancing mutual understanding, and try to apply the lessons from the past to current challenges. Also navigate the challenges with wisdom, vision, and fresh energy. I am extremely lucky, fresh energy. I am extremely lucky because I'm joined today by incredible experts. I had the pleasure to work with them one way or another, and I'm sure most of you have also had the same luck and pleasure, and I'm sure you will if you haven't yet. But let me share a few words of introduction. On my left, I have Jenny Grommel, non-resident fellow at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Then Wilfred Wang, director of the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at CIPRI. Eleonora Neri, international relations specialist at the Vienna Institute for Global Studies at the Modul University. And Fer Avar, PhD researcher in international security at the University of Antwerp, and also a former mentee of the Young Women Next Generation Initiative. For those of you who are not familiar with the Young Women Next Generation Initiative, look it up. It's, it's one of the flagship initiatives that the EU sponsors to foster young professionals in the field. So, I would like to start this conversation with you, Jenny, if you don't mind. You have an incredible experience. You've worked for the US State Department for 38 years, and you've seen it all, I'm sure. So you've negotiated with different actors from different regions, different countries. So I would like to ask you, how do you see the landscape of non-proliferation and arms control developing, and what changes have you seen or you're witnessing?
I want to thank you, Federica, for letting me join this panel. It's really an honor. I've been to this conference every year for as long as I think it's existed, and always in a support role for the P5 panel on the first day, I've just retired, and it's nice to be on the outside and still amongst family. Thank you. Yes, I need to practice my outside personality. In keeping with the 4 minutes that we're allowed, I'll be a little bit more scripted than normal. Let me first say that I strongly support those young speakers yesterday and today who emphasized that we need to reimagine our field. Based on my experience, I believe there are 4 critical approaches that will be necessary to broach the diverse threats and opportunities, not to be forgotten, facing international security moving forward. The 4 are the need for a cross-disciplinary, cross-regional, cross-generational focus. And related to this, to provide support for the critical crossover of young experts to a career path. Well, high praise to the EU consortium partners. These 4 categories are well supported in this conference and in the consortium approach overall and its effect. Cross-discipline. For nearly 4 decades, I've emphasized the need for nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological, including conventional communities, to work together. I take Una's point just now in the BWC session that linkage is not always helpful to progress. This was true in advancing the Middle East peace process, arms control, and regional security working group. In the early 90s, we were exchanging military doctrines and having incident at sea exercises across the region. And we were addressing the military aspect as discussed in the Middle East panel this morning. However, on the long-term objectives papers, which were my bailiwick, in the political track, the nuclear focus derailed the core countries from joining the CWC and the BWC. However, one of my better examples is when the Kenyan delegates would come to the BWC meetings and they would ask for support for mosquito eradication. And you were able to tell them, go to the IAEA Technical Secretariat, they'll write the plan for you, they'll find the member state funding, and through this, you're able to reduce malaria using nuclear technologies and applications. In the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that reduced the WMD stockpiles and employed the scientists, they worked in parallel, but were not fully cross-disciplinary. And really the only time when all the disciplines worked very closely together was during the Iraq UN Special Commission Monitoring Group, UNSCOM, when it was the first time I, at the time, who'd done nuclear, chem, and biological, had never met the missile experts. And they were, of course, the delivery vehicles for chem and bio. The existential threats are beginning to emerge. Our son asked, you were supposed to take care of your existential threats so I could take care of mine. And this was when the money, as Bolsonaro said, we need to emphasize, if the amount of money that has gone into military buildup had gone into climate, we'd be in a different place. And we very much feel that in our family and in our work. COVID, though, should have taught us that biological risks are also existential and just as omnipresent as climate and nuclear risks. In fact, they go hand in hand as the planet warms and new diseases are developing. They can be naturally occurring, but also man-made, as we learned in the last panel. Solutions will necessarily have to be multidimensional and multi-sectoral. Young experts need to broaden their focus beyond nuclear weapons, both for their broader perspectives, but also for your job prospects. On the cross-regional front, my multilateral training grounds of the Conference on Disarmament for the NPT, the CWC, the BWC, they're a shell of what they were when we had active negotiations. There we work cross-regionally every day. Thankfully, the fellowships that didn't exist in my youth are now concentrating on bringing the world together. The EU Consortium Mentorship Program, and thank you for all your efforts, that occurs alongside this conference has brought me a new friend from Madagascar, my first friend from Madagascar. She knows who she is. Working closely with a group of Black Sea mid-career professionals, it's clear that the lessons of Putin's actions are those that counterparts in Asia and the Middle East can also take to heart. We need to work hard to keep these bridges strong, especially given the seismic shifts in the geopolitics of today. And finally, on cross-generational, for the 50th anniversary of the NPT, I coordinated an effort to declassify the negotiating record, and I asked the Russians and the UK to do the same. When I retired from the State Department recently, I understood that few could bring together my elders, my counterparts, and the next generations across the disciplines and the regions, because I had been so fortunate to cross through so many communities. And now I'm actively involved in bringing the public the files of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which was established by John F. Kennedy in 1963 to have an independent voice, separate from the State Department. And it was abolished, put into the State Department as the price by Senator Jesse Helms to allow ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But I'm pulling together these papers, the personal papers of our negotiators, and trying to make sure that the next generation meets the people, but also that the lessons are carried through in the documents. I think all understand that the lessons of the past will prove valuable, even in the age of cyber, AI, and quantum, to guide our future actions. I'm particularly pleased that 150 global experts applied to the newly established oral history program that the Stanley Center and BASIC have launched. They're choosing to learn the formal techniques involved in recording oral histories. The next generation wants to and understands the need. We were just last week in Istanbul, and it was a pretty impressive effort. There clearly is a great need to pass on knowledge as we enter a new era. This brings me to the necessity, again, to preserve your records. There will be a day after all of this turmoil, and it's essential that the coming generations can study our US-Soviet arms control details and all the multilateral negotiations since. I'll point out at this point, I didn't want to be political, but I think it's important that I pass on that my era in arms control, our counterparts were those who are in charge in Moscow. Lavrov, Mamedov, Antonov, Ulyanov, these were our counterparts for decades. And they're able to pull down the pillars of their career's work because the whole focus, of course, is on the war now in Russia. As someone said yesterday, Polina said yesterday, my worry is who comes after Putin. And her answer was, what if there's a US presidential person in place? If Trump were to come to power in Russia, we wouldn't any longer have these people that are part of our community that we grew up with. They know exactly what they're doing. What when there are people who don't know our world? I think this is sort of terrifying. And my answer to that is that our records will remind of the lessons learned. And finally, crossover support. I think almost everybody in this room recognizes the crisis of our coming generations. They have few opportunities to move from the remarkable and now stable next generation networks onto a career ladder. The OPCW, the IAEA, CTBTO, and all the other UN agencies, NATO, require this 7 years of professional work to compete for positions. A decade ago, I was working behind the scenes to fill the fading pipeline. But now it's clear that there's no clear entry and exit point, but more of a slippery ladder to conquer. My analogy is a tempting Everest base camp. Your Sherpas lay the metal ladder across the abyss. Your graduate school training provides you crampons for added sure footing on the trek, but now they must be put in your pack at this phase. Now, knowing you walk the ladder alone, balancing your physical and psychological strength, you fear falling into the crevasse. What we in this room and our counterparts across generations, regions, disciplines need to work on is providing a well-woven, strong rope that Sherpas can throw to each other to give this generation a guiding hand to cross over into a funded career and a warm tent. If they were to fall, they can rest assured we are belayed to them. We're clipped into their aspirations and pulling them back up on the hardest days. The summit lies many steps ahead, but the path is clear, and together, even the harsh weather we're facing, we can stick together. The other concern is for those hikers continuing beyond the base camp and whether they will continue to receive training and outreach as they ascend. Our community needs to lock elbows now. Please do what you can to support the journey for all.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for touching upon many important issues and also the necessity to foster and encourage the next generation. But back to lesson learned, Wilfred, I would like to go to you now and ask you what lessons from the past, in your view, including the Cold War, can be applied to how we look at the strategic context today, and what are the limitations of this comparison?
First, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. Though it was a real blow to find out that I'm no longer next generation. No, and just to echo Jenny's point that I think the Young Women and Next Generation initiative is super important, and I'm very proud to be a part of that as well. I think all of us can acknowledge that it's an incredibly challenging strategic context, unprecedented in some ways, but not all. And certainly there's a lot of value in drawing from history. I think the Cold War showed that multilateral cooperation was possible despite fierce strategic and economic rivalry and fundamental ideological difference as well. Both sides agreed on key principles centered on avoiding the worst case scenario of nuclear use, and took steps to maintain some level of stability, predictability, and so forth. Of course, the context has changed, and the contestation between states is a trademark of the era. We're living in a more multipolar environment with more complexity, with greater impact of more relevant, sophisticated, strategic, conventional capabilities. As has been discussed over the course of the last couple of days, the nature of warfare and security strategy has changed, including with cross and multi-domain operations. And so is thinking about nuclear deterrence. In addition, more change is yet to come, right, because of unforeseen impacts of technological advances, which are scaling, as well as other variables and phenomena, including climate change, for instance. And what is also complicating is that all of these issues are being entangled, so it makes it really hard to progress on one thing without addressing all of these other things. So while acknowledging kind of these real differences, there's a balance where we want to be very aware of the past as experts, civil society officials, but also not be too constrained by it. So this means that remembering that we're not starting from scratch in terms of arms control, risk reduction tools, mechanisms, platforms for dialogues, and so forth. But at the same time, while it's important to revisit these and update the arrangements that exist, there's also a danger in drawing what might appear to be easy parallels, transposing the US-Soviet or US-Russian relationship onto US-China, for instance, or focusing on too much on verifiable, numbers-oriented approaches to arms control. And I was very glad to hear some of our official colleagues warn against this as well. I think we need to be more critical and consider the assumptions and concepts behind these to see if they're still applicable and to be a bit more creative about what governance looks like. It's also essential to remember all of the hard work it took to build existing structures, the importance of process and not just outcome. And I think unfortunately these days, and this I think builds a little bit on Jenny's comments as well, we need to consider the consequences of the deterioration of existing structures in terms of the burden that it's creating and the work it's creating for the next process to rebuild that level of stability. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wilfred. Very interesting on point. I want to stop on the silver lining that we're not starting from scratch, and you know, there's still a structure there. But on these lines, Fer, I would love to go to you. As someone who's entering the field now, what do you think are the most urgent issues that the disarmament community is not yet paying attention to?
Thank you, Federica. I hope this works. What a stellar panel. I'm so honored to be here. I'll get right to it because we're under some time constraints. We've devoted some significant time for discussing emerging and disruptive technologies themselves, rightfully so. But I believe that we pay far less attention to the infrastructures behind them. So these are digital platforms, data architectures, and cloud systems that enable both governments and international organizations and civil society to function today. The infrastructure of war has changed. We all know this. It's no longer metal and munitions only, but it's increasingly so code, cloud, and data. Now, in this context, they're also increasingly governed by platform business models, which is what my work concerns today. In this context, I believe that the disarmament community is overlooking an integral front. That would be our digital platform dependency as organizations. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean the organization's structural reliance for their communications, for their data management, and their core operations relied on external and privately owned data platforms. These infrastructures are designed and owned by a small number of powerful tech corporations, monopolistic, oligopolistic, some sometimes say even feudalistic in nature. And today they form the bedrock of our defense and security architecture. Our operational reliance on them creates vulnerabilities relating to external control, sanctions, as well as data sovereignty risks. In this context, the recent reaction of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to transition its entire digital platform outside of Microsoft 365 to the open source alternative, OpenDesk, which is a European open source alternative, is, I find, to be instructive. It reiterates that data and infrastructural reliance is not a merely technical issue. It is a strategic and normative vulnerability in our institutions. Now, let's lean in on this normative part, because I think this is also a matter of values. I mean here the need for deliberate reduction on dependence on corporations that sustain and profit from infrastructures of endless war, whose accountability lies to shareholders rather than citizens, and who act as the predominant fuel for the arms race today. Now, deplatformization in this case is not merely a protest function. It would be our normative and strategic governance to first and foremost safeguard our institutional sovereignty, allowing us to align our institutional behavior with the principles and practices of verification, transparency, accountability that this community has long championed. Practically, this would mean adopting procurement policies that are primarily open source and non-militarized in nature, even when, and I think most importantly, when it is less convenient. In this context, I will wrap up. Digital disarmament, too, I believe, must become our practice in this.
Thank you so much, Fer. Extremely interesting point, and I really want to go back to your research in a second, but first I want to ask a question to Eleonora as well. Going back a little bit to what Jenny was talking about, so all the anxieties of our time, right, and new nuclear challenges, from the war in Ukraine to the recent declaration about a possible resumption of nuclear testing, which, as a researcher, we talked a little bit about yesterday, but we really didn't receive concrete answers, I would say. So something to have out there.
Don't expect so many answers.
Yeah. But specifically, what lessons can we draw about the resilience of the global non-proliferation norm, and particularly the CTBT, based on your professional experience?
Thank you very much. So, yeah. So, yes, I would like to share some observations and reflections. Yeah, of course, there are personal reflections and observations that I have observed while I was working at the CTBTO exactly at that time. So we're talking about 2022, 2024, you know, with the war in Ukraine. And of course, during that time, you know, we have witnessed repeated nuclear threats, of course, about the potential use of nuclear weapons. And I mean, in 2023, of course, what we witness is, of course, the Russian Federation deratification of the CTBT. But yet, during that same time, between 2022 and 2024, we have witnessed a de-ratification, but we have also witnessed 9 new ratifications of the CTBT, and plus also 1 signature. This says a lot. And it's really showed that there was a renewed momentum towards that. And demonstrates really a strong political commitment to a world free of nuclear weapon states. So you can see that other states were stepping up, and they were giving a clear signal that the vast majority of states continue to view the CTBT as an essential instrument for international stability. So you can see that working there, what I have observed is that actually the war in Ukraine has acted both as a catalyst and also like an alarm bell, reminding the world that this instrument, which is the CTBT, was worth preserving. And in fact, it is worth mentioning that revoking of the ratification didn't mean withdrawal from the CTBT. And what I've noticed as well is that, yes, there was the de-ratification, but also, soon after, there was also completion of an IMS station on the territory of the Russian Federation, which, in my opinion, showed, okay, there is still some engagement towards this instrument, an engagement toward monitoring system. And in fact, what I noticed is that during a time of heightened concern over political, potential resumption of nuclear testing, the IMS really plays a necessary role in encouraging all these Annex II states and other states to really engage actively and to enhance, a monitoring and detection potential for nuclear test activity in their region. Another thing I've noticed is also, of course, the voluntary contributions that there are. I mean, the IMS station is a network full of stations that is aging right now, going over 3 decades of stations. And there are voluntary contributions from Annex II states as well in order to bring that forward. If you think about it, it's this system, this monitoring global network supports the NPT, the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I mean, the CTBT is envisioned in the NPT preamble. And I mean, this is important because you can see that such an instrument, in such a turmoil, it's still being supported somehow. So, when I was asked to talk in this panel, about the future of non-proliferation disarmament, I mean, I have to be honest, I was a bit like, I don't know what I'm going to say. But at the same time, I thought about it, and I was like, you know what? In my opinion, peace is really the absence of borders. And the IMS, which is this international monitoring system, this global network, really tries to transcend those borders and unite states to something bigger, to something greater. So this is how I see the future of non-proliferation disarmament, especially on the nuclear field, is like trying to make states part of something bigger. Again, I always try to put some optimism in this difficult time. Yeah, you can see that. So sorry for having a bit of a vision, of a dreamy vision, but I mean, in the end of the day, I always say optimism is contagious, and we got to push forward. We have all mentees here on the floor, so. So I get to think to myself, I was like, look, imagine, I mean, the CTBT is an instrument that has not yet entered into force and has done already so much. This, what tells me, is like, oh, wow, such a treaty, has so much value already, and it hasn't even entered into force. And what does this tell us? It tells us that these norms are so important, are important to create them, and are important to keep, are important to pursue them and to keep them alive. The CTBT, of course, has established a very powerful norm against nuclear testing. Of course, I'm talking full-scale nuclear testing. And I mean, if you think about it, when it entered into force, when it was opened for signature in 1996, before that, there were 2,000 nuclear tests, and now after that, we only had 10. I mean, it's something that is valuable, and I think we also take things for not granted, but maybe. And of course, if you think about it, in January 2026, we will set actually a new record of the longest period without a single test from the first detonation of the Trinity. I mean, the CTBT really lies on that confidence that nuclear testing will be heard, that the world will know. And this kind of deterrence is born not on threat, but on transparency. And I see this as a future of the non-proliferation disarmament. It is this transparency of deterrence. Now, of course, voluntary moratoria is extremely important, but they're fragile. And of course, it cannot be replaced, but we cannot replace a legally binding ban. So of course, CTBT entry into force is necessary and it's urgent, especially now where we're talking about the possibility of a resumption of nuclear testing. Of course, you see that in a moment of crisis and instability, there can also be a strengthening of our collective resolve. So this is what I see. I see an opportunity. I see other states stepping up. The CTBT has once again returned in the global spotlight because of that. And so in its 30th anniversary in 2026 and the 2026 NPT Review Conference, I see this opportunity to step up together and find for solution. I mean, after all, history has shown that crisis has often led to major breakthroughs in disarmament. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it's a moment of extreme global tension. But just 1 year later, the world leaders agreed on their earliest and most significant arms control treaties, the Partial Ban Test Treaty. So I want to believe this. I need to believe this.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. Thank you for bringing this wave of optimism with us. And this is the fresh energy I was talking about at the beginning, But thank you for your remarks. And Wilfred, actually, I want to touch upon a little bit of, tag on what Eleonora just said now, but she mostly focused on the role of international organizations, the CTBTO, or the role of states. But sometimes it can feel like, especially if you are a researcher, it feels like you are more of an observer in the field, and it feels like that the nuclear landscape is really just driven by the hands of a selected few. So my question to you is, what is actually the role? There is a role there for think tankers, academics, the civil society, or even those non-nuclear weapon states that are not so, part of the smaller elite conversation. What is this role? And how, most importantly, can the research community talk about arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament without being perceived as naive, especially in a geopolitical context as the current one? Thanks.
Thanks for that. And I'll also try to provide a bit more optimism with my second answer as well. So even recognizing current difficulties, I would start by pointing to areas where there's really been demonstrative progress in the last 5 or 10 years, whether by adversaries or like-minded states or whomever, right? So there's been common interest in exploring the potentially destabilizing effects of emerging technologies, and in particular, artificial intelligence. There's been technical cooperation, including on verification, matters of nuclear safety and security, and other such aspects. And we can look at where our knowledge base is on risk awareness and risk reduction, both on the probabilities and the consequences side of the risk equation, including with the work of the humanitarian movement. And I think it's really important to recognize the contributions on each of these issues from parties outside the P5 or the N9, right? Whether it's non-nuclear armed states or civil society, researchers, activists, and so forth. And the role they've played in terms of thought leadership and generating ideas with working papers, statements, and so forth, for instance, with 1 billion concrete ideas on how to take risk reduction forward. In terms of convening forums and dialogues on taking the conversation forward on human control and nuclear decision-making, for instance, with the REAIM process that the Netherlands and ROK have taken the lead on. And just simply to draw public attention to the specter of nuclear war and the urgency of the situation, for instance, with the Nobel Peace Prize last year being awarded to Nihon Hidankyu, or from ICANN almost a decade ago, right? So it's so important, I think, for all of these different groups, all of whom have the same fundamental objective towards a nuclear weapons-free world, to exchange ideas, to critically evaluate concepts, and really establish a culture of accountability. And I think this is related to your question about arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation, because ultimately these are the only long-term solutions to nuclear crises, to addressing nuclear anxieties and so forth. And that's something that's been made, I think, abundantly clear as important as risk reduction is, and as someone who works a fair amount on that issue, it's also a Band-Aid, right? It has to exist in a larger framework with some form of arms control, whatever it is, with strategic stability dialogue, with principled agreements and concrete follow-through. Risk reduction becomes less effective, one, if there are more risks to reduce, and two, if there are just more crises ongoing that create these situations in which inadvertent or advertent nuclear escalation might take place. So I don't think it's about being naive. I think it's recognizing the reality that we need concrete actions to pause or reverse existing trends, which I think many of us can agree we're moving towards arms racing and we're moving towards destabilization. I think there's also a danger that these kind of ongoing dynamics in terms of modernization, investments in strategic capabilities, whether nuclear or conventional, or thinking about these aspects have longer term consequences. And this is what I alluded to in my first answer as well. We need to kind of ensure that these windows for engagement aren't being closed as a result of what is happening now. Because otherwise, this idea of kind of negotiating when the circumstances allow or when the conditions improve, that's never going to happen, right? So I think we need to take ownership of where we are as a community. So, thanks.
Thank you so much. Very well said and in very practical terms. I loved the answer. But Fer, I promised I was going back to you to shed a light on your research, because I find it extremely fascinating talking about digital platform dependency and the nexus between security and defense practices and the private defense tech corporations. So from your research so far, how do you see the growing role of private defense and tech corporations shaping the future of disarmament and arms control and non-proliferation?
Thank you, Fede. I'll promise to keep this one shorter. Is it not working now? Is it good? Yeah, that's a practice one. Okay. I first thought about speaking of the dichotomy between the functioning logic of defense tech corporations and arms control values. And I thought, in the spirit of reimagining, and also in my belief in this community's more generative potential, I thought it would be more useful to move beyond diagnostic talk and actually talk about something a bit more concrete. So it became a bit simpler. It's the arms control community's ability to help shape how defense tech corporations should operate in war and peace times. Arms control and disarmament, as we all know, is built on restraint, verification, and trust building. It aims for norm setting, and then it verifies through verification. It provides at the core a politics of deceleration. It's slowing down. It's tools for slowing down and of deliberation. Now, on the other hand, as Dr. Schwartz beautifully laid out in the previous panel for me, defense tech runs on endless acceleration, presented as security, control, and even democracy nowadays. Its logic is scaling, acceleration, and market capture. In short, it is move fast and break things. I'm sure you're more familiar with that terminology nowadays. We know that perpetual crisis and exceptionalism disables democratic oversight. And we also know that the political economy of war depends on sustained conflict to secure investor returns. So, in this reactive, multipolar moment today, what's missing are international norms to govern corporate behavior. So I think it is to spell out the responsibilities of private tech actors in both war and peace times. This is where I see that the arms control community has a role to play, one of norm setting, that is, so that we can build tools that weave democratic accountability, transparency, and ethical restraint into the defense tech environments, and also to the innovation ecosystem from the bottom up itself. To close off, I would also like to remind all of us that before the NPT, there was the construction of the nuclear taboo. So this all starts with norm setting. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fer. Please keep us posted with the publication because I think everybody's, at least I am, but I'm sure other people are very interested in reading your findings. We have still a little bit of time, so Jenny, I will go back to you, if you don't mind. And with a bit of a more practical type of question, but from your experience, do you have any specific advice for both entry-level and mid-career experts on how to enhance and further their career?
Yes, of course. And many of you will know these, but these are lessons I've learned since I was 22, and I'm now 62. And I think that they apply to everyone. One of them was the first day I started in the office of Bob Mikulak, our CWC ambassador. He had above his desk a big black and white photograph, and it was of the people that had perished in Halabja. And the point of having this above his desk was to remind us that you're not sitting in a nice conference room. You're here to save lives. And we expect you to put your heart and your soul into those people you might have saved. And right next to that is a very nice framed picture that says patience and fortitude. And those were always the lessons we felt when we were in his office was you sit for years doing chemical weapons convention negotiations and perhaps even longer doing biological weapons convention. And I started when I was young doing the NPT. It takes years and years to do this, but remember what the purpose is. Let's hope you're able to save lives. And of course, we've gone through the use of chemical weapons in Syria and also the assassination weapons. As you said, it's the norms, it's the people that we knew then in the Conference on Disarmament in the late 80s. Rafael Grossi, one of the NPT cycles, every single one of the chairmen was someone I had known from this tiny working group that we had in Geneva. So remember why you're here and what your purpose is. The next thing that I want to pass on from him was, well, one note of advice. He would ask people when they came to an interview, what book are you reading? And that was fascinating. And sometimes I would let people know 30 seconds in advance, but I found that that was a very interesting question from him. But he would say, go determine the answer. And you'd have big, complicated project, and he expected you maybe not even to come back and share what your solution was. But there would always be a moment where you needed top cover. And he would say, let your conscience be your guide. Let my conscience be my guide. I need a real answer right now. The National Security Council meeting's in 10 minutes, and I came up with this, and please, be my elder. And the answer, year after year, let your conscience be your guide. What it really meant was, do the right thing. Do the right thing. And a good friend of mine recently pointed out, one of the lessons was, make sure that you're proud of yourself from your perspective as an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old. These are the days of our lives right now. Make sure you let your conscience be your guide. And one of my favorite things I tell young people is, and it's a sign of the times, that it starts out with, he who holds the pen owns the meeting. This was the entry point for me for the US-Soviet chemical talks. I was the imported idiot, let's say, to be a congressional staffer for the Defense Science Board and the Jasons when we were talking about Strategic Defense Initiative, Brilliant Pebbles. Always, always take it as an honor that they let you in the room, because then you're learning how they negotiate. And it may be that it's because you're a note taker, but if you're a damn good note taker, you're going to get into a lot of places. And what's interesting about that is now when I look back, as the right hand of the ambassador for many decades and many different fora, is that he who holds the pen owns the meeting. As I'm doing all this oral history, I realize it was my interpretation that is registered in the history. of our world. Get in the game, volunteer. And my very last one, and many of you know this, my life motto is, it never hurts to ask, and a good handshake. And I'd be glad to try it on any of you. It makes a big difference. It's the first and the last human contact you have with someone. Show them you mean it. You'll follow through, you care. And these are sort of the basic lessons I hope that any age pays attention to, because they're basic human traits, but we need them now more than ever. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I love this. I wrote them down because, you know. But I think we have a little bit more time left, so I would love to open the floor for questions. Oh, sorry, Eleonora, did I miss you? Let me check my outline.
Too much positivism.
I'm
right?
very sorry.
Too much optimism here. It's like, that's,
I was carried away by...
no worries.
Actually, I was thinking, wow, we really did good on time, but that's the reason. So, Eleonora, from your experience with youth programs, because I know you worked a lot with the CTBT youth group, what lessons would you share as well? We working with young professionals, and how can we help shape the next generation of disarmament diplomats and disarmament researchers? Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. Okay, so I will try to keep it short, yes, because indeed it's nice to have more of a Q&A session, yes. So again, I will share, what I've observed and what I've learned through this process, yeah. So I, as you mentioned, Federica, was a CTBTO youth group coordinator. And what always fascinated me about that group is that, of course, as you know, the treaty has not yet entered into force. And through the CTBTO youth group, we actually had the opportunity to actually speak and talk and have people, have young professional and youth that were from states and countries that did not yet join the treaty. And I mean, it was fantastic, to have this, this direct contact with that youth. I mean, the governments did not even yet join, but we were already communicating with the youth from that country that not even joined the treaty. For me, I found that powerful. And that for me also states and kind of underlines the power of youth in that. I mean, it is exactly this informal and non-political nature of this group that made this engagement possible. I think this, for me, was definitely a lesson learned. And I mean, the young people were getting interested in this treaty. And why? Because this treaty was made for them, for us, for humanity. Of course they want to get involved. And one other lesson that I've learned is that, of course, these instruments, that we have, these institutions that we create, of course, are here to stay. I mean, the young generation will inherit it. Will inherit everything that we have right now, hopefully. The International Monitoring System is a $1 billion investment with 3 decades, years of scientific, financial, diplomatic efforts that is worth preserving. That, that the scientists and the policy makers of tomorrow need to inherit it, so it is important to involve them in this process and keep them engaged. Also, what I've noticed as well is that there is a tremendous enthusiasm among youth in order to get engaged meaningfully in disarmament and non-proliferation initiatives, really. I mean, I've also spoken to the mentees last year, and there is so much hunger for that. It's amazing. There's so much curiosity. There's so much energy flowing that. And I think we need to do everything possible in order to nurture this energy and commitment. And I mean, I had also a wonderful experience at UNODA when I was supporting the Youth Leader Fund for a World Without Nuclear Weapons. I mean, that initiative really is deep to my heart right now. And I was truly inspired to see that we had 100 places for this initiative, and we had 8,500 people applying all over the world. And I mean, as I was going through the applications, I was asking myself, why do we have to pick only 100 people? We need more. I mean, that's why the resources is important. We need more resources. We need more than those 100. And I mean, seeing the passion and determination of really these young people on the first hand in this youth program, really, really reaffirmed my belief that, youth engagement is not beneficial, it's indispensable for future of disarmament diplomacy. It's absolutely important to raise awareness. It's absolutely the first step. The first step is to raise awareness. However, it's not enough. We need to also equip young people with the knowledge and the skill to empower them to really make meaningful contributions, to really make these young people informed global citizens, advance in disarmament and non-proliferation goals. I can see that, of course, we create so much awareness, and then it is important to give them skills and knowledge, because then we need to make sure that these young people find their own way in order to contribute to these non-proliferation disarmament goals. Because, in the end of the day, they are limited resources, the organizations are just a few, there are so many other ways that someone can participate and contribute to this, which is through, ICANN is a wonderful example of that. So I find personally myself hard to keep working on this sector, because there are just that many opportunities. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that we need to create more opportunities for that. But also by raising awareness, by providing skills and knowledge, maybe the youth will find their own ways. Maybe I should create my own NGO, who knows? So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ele. And sorry again for somehow missing your question, but you raised a very important point, because we do so much to incentivize the younger generation to enter the field, but sometimes then there's a cap, a limit. There are not so many job opportunities out there, and unfortunately it seems like in this field particularly there's going to be even less. So thank you so much for raising that very important point. We're still doing well on time, so I would be very happy to open the floor, and I see there are a couple of hands. I see the lady in red in the front, and then...
Thank you very much for this. Is it working? Thank you very much for this inspiring podium. I have a question to Fair Afar. I'm speaking on behalf of PNND, that's Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And of course, we work closely with international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war. This association of doctors, physicians, students held their conference in Nagasaki 1 month ago. And I noted in a speech given by a professor who I believe is from your university, Fair Afar, Tom Sauer, you will correct me, Tom Sauer, who spoke in Nagasaki, and I would like to quote him. To me, he made at least an inspiring hypothesis, not yet abolishing totally arms, but he said, nuclear weapons may no longer be credible deterrents in an era of hypersonic missiles and AI-driven warfare, and suggesting that modern conventional weapons could ultimately replace nuclear arsenals, reshaping global security without risking nuclear annihilation. So I would like you to elaborate on this, and maybe others also. And my second question goes to Jenny. Lessons of the past will prevail. We should hope so. But my question to you is on the Statute of Rome, which laid the foundation for the International Criminal Court in Den Haag 20 years ago, and which should, of course, sanction the most horrible crimes of genocide, war crimes, etc. And neither the United States, nor the Russian Federation, nor the People's Republic of China ever joined the Statute of Rome. This is horrible. We know what's happened since, especially just now, lately. Whereas the Statute of Rome was done after the most brutal wars in Rwanda and in the Western Balkans. And the women's organizations, which I also represent, thought that with the Statute of Rome, we could at least punish, if ever there were again genocide, gender-based violence as war crimes against women who are always the most deprived victims of any conflict and war. What is your lesson, Jenny, drawn from that? I don't have any. We just failed. I mean, the patriarchy, men in the ruling level, just failed, especially the men of those three superpowers. Why?
Thank you very much. We will take a few other questions and then we can go back to the panel. The lady just next to, yes, and then we can go to Stefano Rocca, if I remember.
Thank you so much. My name is Trine. I'm a PhD student at the Danish Institute for International Studies. I absolutely love and adore this panel. I think it's so important. A lot of the time there can almost be a huge weight put on the young generation for this, so I think bridging that gap is amazing. A defense expert that I spoke to a couple of weeks ago in an interview told me disarmament and arms control is a luxury item for times of peace. So when you, Wilfred, are saying take ownership, we need to take ownership of disarmament and arms control today. What are your, Jenny and Wilfred specifically, your recommendations to arguments when you're challenged on the relevance of what we're doing here today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in the back.
Mario Rocca of the Union of Scientists for Disarmament of Italy and of the University of Genova. So I thank Jenny for her appeal. That's very nice. But unfortunately, all the possible channels of contact between scientists, which helped a lot at the time of Pugwash, have been cut. And they have been cut intentionally, especially by the European Union. And now we are facing the situation that, given the fact that the Russian universities were banned from international collaborations, our students are asking to ban also the Israeli universities. So I'm against one and the other ban, but we have a real problem and we should try to understand how we can influence our government, the EU and the US, to stop with this stupidity.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. We will start with you, Fer, so you can touch upon that, and then we can go back to the others.
Thank you. I can, of course, not speak for Tom Sauer, but I will try to respond from my own work and perspective. I think the core of this is that deterrence logics, neither in nuclear nor in military AI governance, should be what we're pushing higher for. I hear echo dear Elena's words yesterday, that it is the norm-building element of our work that should touch upon also the infrastructural elements of today's warfare, right? I'm here trying to speak to not only the technology, not only the actors, and not only the current arms control environment, but also who are these people that we're not speaking of, that I don't want to say run the show, but run the show in infrastructural ways. And of course, they're not alone, right? It's not that corporations exist in a vacuum outside of state boundaries and that defense primes from the past have disappeared. No, of course, they all work in the same network. But it is a networked analysis, an infrastructural analysis of this ecosystem that should push against deterrence logics as the solution for security. As we established, deterrence has existed alongside arms control discourse from its history. We can still maintain the parallel discourse today. That's how I would look at this. And let's hear what Tom says when I give him the question.
Thank you, Fer. Jenny, do you want to jump in?
Yes, certainly. I find your question very personal. And my answer is very personal. And let me conflate it a little bit with your question. I went to school in Vienna when Lech Walesa was just now standing up and starting solidarity. It was the Balkan Wars. They were my Austrian friends who ended up being the rapporteurs for the peace processes. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the new building, is built directly across from the International Criminal Court. Every day I could get away, which wasn't so often, but I would go watch the Milosevic trials. When I had to speak as the US representative on the P5 panel in Hiroshima, I guess that we also had the Iranians, we had some others there, but I had my official talking points, and I started it by saying, you don't do disarmament for 30 years and not believe in it. And I don't know if Mishi will remember this, but some of the Hibaksha gave sort of testimonials to the big newspapers that they had never listened to the US representative in any of these conferences before. And it was that I showed empathy. My parents were part of World War II. My father was in Japan just after the war. It was that personal connection. And then they listened to our official view on deterrence. I was also involved when President Obama came to Hiroshima for the first time, and there you feel very much for your MFA colleagues in Japan who are feeling both sides of it. They come from Hiroshima, they're defending your elderly, the future, but also disarmament versus deterrence. One of the books I've been recommending to people is called East-West Street by Philip Sands. And it's about two young people on either side of the same street in Lviv, which then was becoming German, Polish, this one same town where one of our good friends is from. And it was about, the book is based on letters from one of their mothers on the progression of their lives. And one of them became very influential in the US administration and the other one in the British administration. And they were the two men who drafted the international humanitarian law. Their own perspectives coming from this town that had been overrun, keeping their sense of place. They ended up rising all the way to the top of both of these key administrations just when the Nuremberg trials were coming together and there were no norms. I think the message in all of this is, and I decided to retire for my husband's health reasons before my office was eliminated, my Office of Policy Coordination. There's a whole cadre. If people wanted to do New Start, there are none of us there to do it. I would like you all, for the same reason, to personally stand up and fill the gap until we can come back, to train you all to come take our places. We don't have answers. We just have what we can do personally. And I think in both of these cases, and also it was you who inspired yesterday, this reimagination. All I have is the past to teach you. But there was a lot of inspiration, but it was like Bob Mikulak. It was installed by people. And I think it goes back to many of the movements. When I first started doing this NATO long-term planning, the women were jumping over the fence of Greenham Common. So I ended up working on permissive action links, which help protect nuclear weapons silos. It comes down to being a person who can make a difference. So I think that's my answer is, I don't have institutional answers, but I can tell you I've been highly influenced by other people that have made a big difference. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, Wilfred.
Just a couple of quick comments. One is actually to add on to the question about the conventional capabilities. I guess what I would say is also that the nature of conventional capabilities are changing too, and they're being more explosive effects and more deadly. And so if we're just simply talking about replacing nuclear weapons with something worse or equivalent, then that distinction doesn't really matter. And I would refer back to what Fer was saying, it's about kind of this principle of deterrence. And if you go back to the Cold War, a lot of the more effective deterrence strategies was accompanied with some measure of reassurance at the same time. And maybe this leads me to Trini's question about kind of arms control disarmament in a time of war. Certainly not, meaning to excuse Russia for its violation of sovereignty, for its violation of international law. What I would say is that a lot of the dynamics that are taking place now in terms of investments, deployments, et cetera, these are dynamics that are going to continue regardless of how the war in Ukraine is resolved. And there's obviously a conversation to be had about the future of European security and all of this. Now, I think there have been some signals that Russia is interested in maintaining some level of stability, and that's been brought up yesterday, I think, as far as kind of the offer for extending New START ceilings, at least. And engagement with the US is obviously a prerequisite to any kind of risk reduction, arms control, disarmament. I would also point that there are perhaps regional or sub-regional environments in which engagement is more likely. Russia's position in the high north is different because of the presence of its strategic assets. In the last year, even though it's more about softer issues, it returned to engagement with the Arctic Council working groups, right? So there are these kind of threads where there's possible to engage on these kind of broader issues. And I think the importance now is just simply reestablishing some kind of strategic value structure on which future negotiations can be brought up. And in the previous session, I think Tong was the one who talked about the need for development of a common risk framework. So to really just start having these conversations and not expecting, obviously like a verifiable treaty in the next year or two.
Or that it would be ratified.
Thank you for the sober pointing. Eleonora, do you want to say a few words as well, or should we go?
I just wanted to make maybe a comment because you've mentioned, that these instruments are just needed in a time of peace, correct? That's the... And I also often hear this, and what I think about it, on a personal note, is that, yes, perhaps, but, it's kind of like having a toolbox in front of us. And, they're worth preserving, they're worth, telling states that we have these tools. And of course, when a time comes, when of course there is a much more dialogue, diplomatic tools to do that, then we're ready. We're ready to put them in place. So I think it's more than that for sure. And honestly, when you were talking about the gap, the answer that I get the most of the time is also like, often when I'm in this institute right now on global studies, of course, it doesn't only focuses on non-proliferation disarmament. So I'm there in my new institute, in my new role, and I'm like, oh, please, let's do something about nuclear non-proliferation disarmament, which is my area. So I'm very excited. And the comments that I get from my colleagues is, what is this fancy topic? And I'm like, fancy? And it just always strikes me because every time I actually step out from my usual round of people, that is actually the comment I get most of the time. And I'm like, it's not fancy at all, actually. And actually how you try to, kind of close the gap, I think it's absolutely extremely important, and also to have new opportunities to talk about this with not, let's put it away, always the same people. Thank you.
Thank you, Elia. Well, interesting that you hear the fancy comment. People tell me, why do you cover this depressing topic? But, well, so I would take fancy. But we have 5 minutes more, so maybe we can go, we can have 2 more questions, maybe. Anyone from this side? I see Ambassador Trezza. And anybody else? And Anandi, yes.
My name is Carlo Trezza. I'm former Italian ambassador for disarmament and non-proliferation. I guess I like the title of this panel, Conversation Between Generations. I believe that I belong to the past generation. And I just want to share 2 points that strike me. One is the discrepancy between the enormous efforts that negotiators put into negotiating and ratifying treaty in general, in particular arms control treaty, and the easiness with which some countries can withdraw from the treaty. It's really striking, I would say, and I wonder if, I know that this is a question of domestic jurisdiction, but still, it's an issue that I think we should, to which we have to think about. The other one is also a question of definitions. Wilfred one spoke of P5 and N9. I advocate that the P5 in the framework of the NPT should not be called P5. They are not the permanent members of the Security Council. I mean, they have a different hat. And therefore, I would suggest to call them N5 or whatever you want, but just to make the distinction. You don't need to have nuclear weapons to become a permanent member of the Security Council and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Trezza. Anandi, right? The lady in the...
Hello, I'm Anandi. I'm a trainee with the EU delegation in Vienna and also part of the mentorship program. I hear a lot of talk currently about the difficult situation we're in, but from a lot of the sound of it, it was also quite a difficult situation the first time around when arms control and disarmament treaties came into place. So I think from that place, I was just wondering what practical advice would you have to the current generation, sharing that it's not the first time we've been in a difficult situation when it comes to these topics. So what can we learn from the past generation on how to go forward and how to get to the same place where things were happening and treaties were passed?
Thank you very much, Anandi. Jenny, we will start with you and then we will go on.
Ambassador Trezza, we have been at this a very long time. In 2015, for the NPT Review Conference, it was my responsibility to work with our Russian counterparts on what was originally a Ukrainian draft on measures to withdraw from the treaty. And the North Koreans, DPRK, as we say at the State Department, left the treaty, and the British still don't recognize them. So the state party number is different between the British and the US for this reason. And the purpose was to lay out specific guidance if you were to withdraw. And it included 30 days notice, but one of the important aspects of it was right of return. So Adam Scheinman, my ambassador, is sitting next to me, Mikhail Ulyanov and his young lawyers next to him, and all of a sudden they say we need a break. And it turns out that the right of return is part of US technical arrangements, but it never was for the Soviets or for the Russians, and they realized it at that very point. Bushehr was being built. The process of negotiating, maybe this helps Anandi's question. In the process of looking at the details and being very privately in this world where we knew each other for many years. Turns out Ambassador Ulyanov was part of the G7 group that I would coordinate and our G8 group, and we would travel together. In sort of the coziness of our familiarity, they realized that they had a big gap and they couldn't very well go public with this working paper with the US on withdrawal until they got that fixed. So in the end, it turns out it was a question of discrimination and came up in the nuclear securities suppliers group. And one of the things I was showing someone the other day is that Tariq Rauf, who many of you know from the nuclear community, did a presentation for CIPRI, and it had a picture of sort of the successful multilateral negotiations. And it was a picture in the ECOSOC chamber in New York of the big long table in the middle And I was the drafting person on our working paper, and it was the Iranians and the Russians and the Cubans, everybody surrounded, and we were really getting something done. So the point is, keep at it. And again, it was the Brazilian who ended up being most helpful for me. Just don't let it go. And really now get to know the people that are your cadre and the older ones, because the truth is it's the old friends network in the end, where someone winks or tells you at the last minute, I'll work extra hard on capital to change our position. It's the old friends network that's going to save the day. And Laura and I are both nodding. Please keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Jenny. We are running a little bit late, so I would ask our 3 other panelists just a couple of words. Okay.
I'll be very quick. First, Ambassador, thank you for making the distinction. I think you're right in that it's shorthand that can reinforce these structural inequalities, so I appreciate that. On the question about kind of what lessons, I think empowerment is what I would take. You know, if you look at the anti-nuclear protests of the 1980s, the role of victims of testing in the creation of nuclear weapon test free zones, you know, there's a lot that you can do, you know, still, even in the current circumstance. And maybe just to segue to just some final words, I think one of the themes has been, of this panel has just been the importance of expanding these networks, right? We've talked a lot about engaging youth, but I think it's also just to make sure that the community that studies these issues reflects the world that we're living in and the potential victims of nuclear use, which is everybody, right? And so just wanna, yeah, I mean, I think some of the work that I appreciate the most is the work that I do in the context of the EU-MPDC, with the work we do with the Alva Myrdal Center, with the Odessa Center. I think it's really unique and important in terms of expanding those networks. So I'll stop there.
I don't think there was any questions to me, but I will just use this one moment to thank the consortium also to bring together the mentorship program in a rotating alumni cycle in this way too. It's wonderful to be in a panel with these wonderful colleagues and also get the space for thinking about imagining what is there for us next, because we will be the ones remaining anyways in the end, as we all naturally.
Thank you very much, Fer. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this panel, and please join me in thanking our panel and amazing experts.